genuinely, it would be really tough for a traditional bank to compete with a startup who's AI native, for example, right? It's not the same system. It's not the same regulation. It's not the same team. It's just not the same culture, right? And so that's where the conversations now come around. If we're not able to compete with them, do we buy them? Or, do we want to then start changing the culture within this organization to be a little bit more AI forward? And what does that entail, right? What do we lose from that perspective?
Welcome to Digital Leaders Club. I'm Guillaume Cheno, CEO and founder here at Ingeno. This show is built for the leaders running real-world operations, the ones building and running real businesses while everything around them is being asked to modernize. Today, I'm joined by Awa Kone, expert on cross-border payments and startup advisors. Awa is also the founder and CEO of a CPG brand, Noom. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Guillaume. I'm super happy to be here today.
All right. So before we get into the business side, tell us, how did you end up in being a cross-border payments expert and startup advisor? Was this a deliberate path, or did you life just got you there?
Yeah. So my career path has been a bit unconventional in the sense that I actually started my career as an actuary. So I did a few years as an actuarial consultant, and I think that's where I got a lot of my risk management foundation. After that, I went to the MIT Sloan School of Business where I got my MBA, and that really helped solidify a lot of the leadership and strategy foundation that I've been using throughout my career as well. So over the last 10 years, I've built this reputation as a strategy and operations leader that specializes in cross-border payments, digital assets, and building operational infrastructure to power financial services. So in other words, what I do is my expertise is really in building scalable operations, financial controls, and then also partnerships that enable money movement cross-border to be fast and efficient. Throughout my career, I've also held a number of senior leadership roles in institutions such as Flutterwave, which is the most valuable fintech in Africa, as well as a position as a COO for another payments infrastructure company. Alongside these roles, I've also founded my own CPG brand, Noom, like you mentioned in the introduction. And then I've also done a lot of advisory work with early stage fintech startups in topics such as strategy and operational foundation necessary to scale.
You touched it a bit here, but tell us what is a cross-border payment expert? What's the typical day-to-day life in that kind of role?
So I'd say, there's no typical day-to-day, right? There's a lot going on when you're managing money movements. And obviously the room for error is zero because it's not your money, right? But I'd say if I can kind of summarize my days into three buckets, it would be one is strategic meetings, and those could be internal meetings or external meetings, right? So internal would be things like aligning with the leadership team or with product, engineering, risk and compliance. External meetings could be anything from, having conversations with auditors, regulators, or, our banking partners. And then the second part is really analytical work. I've mentioned before, I started my career as an actuary. I love being in the data and the numbers. I'm somebody who is not afraid to roll up her sleeve and do like a working session, be it with my reconciliation team or my treasury team, and really get into the weeds of the data and the numbers and understand how we can improve our processes day to day. And then the third part of it is really firefighting, right? So I like to describe working in payments as someone watching milk over a stove. If you've ever done that, you have to, be constantly on top of things. You have to be constantly on top of monitoring what's going on. And, it could be that you're brought into a conversation that has escalated with a partner in a completely different time zone. Maybe it's not even in English, it's a different language. I speak French, so sometimes that helped, but there's just a lot of firefighting. There's a lot of potential for, failure points and being available and being decisive in those moments such that they don't affect the consumer experience is a really important part of the role.
Very interesting. So tell me, what's the hardest part of your job that maybe someone outside this business wouldn't probably appreciate?
Yeah, I think so when you're not in payments, right, and you just swipe your card or you do a financial transaction, you don't understand how many players sit in the back end of these transactions to ensure that, the money is moving from you to the final recipient, for example, right? And so for every payment type, for every transaction, it's almost as if you have this whole ecosystem behind those transactions made up of, banks, financial institutions, liquidity providers, card schemes, regulatory framework. And if you're working in the global environment like we are, you're essentially then adding on top of that, FX risks. You're adding, FX providers. You're also adding different regulatory regimes. And so most of these players, it doesn't necessarily sit within your control as a leader within the operations of the organization, but your role at the end of the day is to ensure that you're able to orchestrate this complexity in a way that is going to run smooth, fast, efficiently, and more importantly, not affect your client's experience, right? And so to me, that's the most challenging part is having to constantly be able to anticipate the potential, areas of failure, making sure that things are running smoothly, jumping from one point to the next and just being constantly on. I think that's probably the hardest part, but it is also part of the challenge is it actually what makes the role exciting.
So how is technology these days playing, let's say, a leveraging role into making those challenges easier or yeah, more efficient to tackle?
Yeah, I mean, technology has always been an enabler, right? Whether it was with, internet or, Microsoft or where we are right now with AI, right? Technology has always been an enabler. And from my personal perspective, I think that's definitely how I'd like to see technology, right? Not necessarily as a replacement for the human work, but kind of an opportunity for us to put in place the right framework to ensure that we're utilizing technology to the best of, our intention, making sure that, it's removing a lot of the frictions that we have, be it from a product perspective, right? Moving money cross border is expensive, it takes time, or be it from a team perspective where you have significant number of people doing very manual work and you want to kind of remove that down, right? So that's kind of how I like to think about technology. We can talk specifically about AI, but that's in general, that's how I like to think about technology.
Awesome. So can you give examples where you've seen leveraging AI, data, or technology in general and being successful?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So for AI specifically, I think there's a few areas where AI makes a lot of sense within the operational world for a payment company. One of them being transaction monitoring, right? You need to constantly be monitoring your transaction, identifying any unusual patterns that could potentially be fraudulent. Another one is customer support, right? You have those AI agents who are answering questions as the first line of interaction prior to potentially escalating to a human when there's something more important that's happening, right? What I'm actually quite excited about with AI and operations right now is reconciliation. And I don't think people talk about that a lot, right? If you are managing operations for a global infrastructure company, on a day to day basis, you're managing hundreds of partners, right? Across different continents, different countries, different languages, different currencies, right? And as you're managing those partners, you're constantly asking yourselves two questions. One is visibility into your balances, right? Where's all the money and how much is it? That's something that you need to know, right? I mean, that's like number one thing to run your business. And then the number two is, what is your trust in that number, right? And that's where reconciliation comes into play. And if you are running this large and complex operation, you'll find that there's no harmonization in terms of the reporting that you'll get, whether it's from a bank or, a financial, like a PSP or a mobile money operator. The reporting are completely different. That's number one. Even with the same partner, the reporting can change from week to week, right?
Mhm.
And so what a lot of people have had to do is, hire a bunch of people to comb through all of these statements, figure out the right answers, or you can bring in a vendor that's, going to do like a treasury management system or reconciliation for you. But because there's so many hedge cases in the environment where you operate because of the complexity, you still need a lot of manual work, right? And this is where AI can and has, I've seen AI really be super helpful in terms of doing that initial work of cleaning up the data and harmonizing the report and kind of doing that initial quick work of weeding out any kind of error or things that don't make sense. And that's something that I'm super excited about. I think if you're running an organization, that's such an opportunity to free up some time from your team from a lot of those manual work and doing the actual work of the next stage, which is investigating unusual movements or actually spending time building better relationships with your banking partners or doing more exciting things.
Makes sense. Do you see areas where data AI is not currently leveraged in your industry, and it would make sense to do it, and why hasn't it been done already?
It's an interesting question. I think that there's so many areas within operations, compliance, even engineering, right, where AI is going to be very powerful in again removing a lot of the frictions and the challenges that we have as an industry. The reasons why it's not necessarily being done or hasn't been done is because AI and technology in general is not going to bring about clarity when there isn't clarity, right? It's not going to be a magic wand to solve all of our problems, right? That's number one. And number two is there are issues that come with AI, right? AI is not going, it's not just because you've signed up for AI, the output is going to be, even true or perfect, right? We hear all the time people being upset because, Claude or Chat GPT lied to them, right? So you still need that human, not only check at the end, but I'd say even at the onset, you need that human to operate the AI, right? And in order for the human to operate the AI, the human needs to have a really sound understanding of what needs to be done. You need to have the right policies in place and the right framework when it comes to things like data privacy, right? We're working in very, very highly regulated environments. You need to understand what kind of data is permissible to share with what vendor and what tools. And so there are a number of challenges around the way in which the industry is able to utilize AI. But I do think that at the end of the day, as a leader, we're all looking at different ways and avenues to, again, use technology to improve our lives and the lives of our teams.
Right, but could AI help you be more compliant? So could you reverse that into, well, I need to be cautious about how I use AI because of regulations, but instead, let's say I'm going to use AI to be even better at being compliant with the regulation, right? And if let's say some new law is adopted, right? Or some rule is changed. How do you keep up with those changes and make sure that you're always compliant? So could AI be leveraged for that?
Absolutely. Absolutely, right? So if you think about the example that I provided before, right? If you think about that reconciliation example, you've got 200, 500 bank accounts, you've got all of these reports. AI is going to allow you to cut down on the time it requires you, for example, to identify, all of your balances or maybe some unusual movements that has happened. If you're a smaller organization and you don't have the funds to buy, this great treasury management tool, you can certainly use AI to cut down on the number of man hours that you need to be able to quickly get to the answer. It could also be used for, putting it together your regulatory reporting, right? Those are some of the things that you need to do. And so it can help you with a lot of those things. What I'm saying is And this is where the risk is when the AI spits out the report that you're supposed to provide to the regulator. Is someone actually reviewing it to ensure that it is correct, right? Versus just grabbing it and sending it to the regulator, and maybe it doesn't have the right specs, it's not for the right regulator. And so it is a tool, and with the tool comes a certain number of responsibilities and requirement that one needs to be very attuned to.
Right. So it's like you said, it's not about replacing the human, but rather augment them. Yeah. So, in your opinion, what's the biggest opportunity for your industry in terms of leveraging technology, AI, your data, so that people or organizations doing that kind of change would have an edge over the others?
I think one of the biggest problem and the biggest opportunities in payments is interoperability. But that is the biggest problem, right? So if you are looking to move money from one payment type to the next, right? It's very, very difficult. It's very tough. Even within the same countries, sometimes you can't. You can't move from your mobile money wallet, for example, to your bank account, or from an instant payment rail to your bank account. So that to me is one of the biggest opportunity, but it's also the most challenging one, right? Because there is regulatory framework, there's all of these things that come into play, and a lot of people obviously are working on solutions and things of that nature, not only just with AI but also just technology in general, things like stablecoin, for example, which are you know allowing us to move money cross border much faster in the most cost efficient manner. Again, it is a very difficult problem, and trying to get different regulators, different industry partners on the same page is a very, very difficult thing to do.
Very interesting. So, let's say you could travel back in time and talk to Awa from a couple of years back. What would you tell yourself in terms of how to, I don't know, address change management around technology adoption? What things have worked? What things are going to not work as well as you thought? Yeah, what kind of advice would you give yourself?
That's a very interesting question. The advice I'll give myself is it's not necessarily going to go according to plan, but it will work out, right? And I think in business, especially when you operate in startups, you can plan for every single scenario, right? You can have so many different plans, plan A, plan B, plan C, but at the end of the day, the reality is just not going to happen the way that you thought about it. And that's where being constantly ready, being, agile, being very flexible and quick on your feet, and, constantly looking for that next innovation and that problem solving mentality is going to come into play. And so, for me, I think that's the biggest lesson is it's not going to happen the way you anticipated all the time, but that's absolutely okay, right? Because you're ready.
Hmm, very good advice to yourself. I think I would do the same for my younger self. So, from what you're saying, it seems like your industry is already adopting AI, whereas what we see, let's say, I'm in Canada, so I see many companies in the manufacturing industry, for example, being a bit late in adopting AI, cloud, and that kind of things. So it seems like your industry is kind of advanced in that sense. So am I getting this right, or it depends? Because typically in finance and stuff like that, companies are super conservative, right? They don't tend to like change, and then don't tend to like taking risks with technology.
Right. That's the distinction I was actually going to make, right? I've worked in startups, which are
Mm.
notoriously, prone to innovation and constantly looking for the best way, the fastest or the more agile way to solve problems and easier to adapt technology, right? It's not the same for someone who may have been working in the bank or an insurance company, right? So there you do have different sets of regulations, you do have different set of legacy systems that may or may not be prone to supporting a lot of these new innovation and technologies. So the experience would be completely different if I was working in a bank, for example. But you do see a lot of the big players even investing in some of those new technologies, either through buying other organizations or institutions or looking to build their own. But it's not a simple thing to move a mammoth. right? It's very hard and it's very difficult. So the perception can be very different depending on where you stand in that spectrum of the financial services.
Makes a lot of sense. So for let's say older players and bigger players, aside from let's say the obvious of just saying there might be a startup passing you because you're too slow to adopt, what are the concrete risks? Because what I feel is in your field, the barrier to entry is kind of high because you cannot just improvise yourself as a payment platform, right? There's a lot of gates to pass, right? So because of that, let's say I own a bigger organization that does that. Do I have some head start or compared to startups, or it's still I need to adopt AI right now?
I think AI is here to stay. I think a lot of these new technologies are here to stay, right? Same thing with stablecoin. There was recently an announcement of a new stablecoin from a consortium of like 150 industry players, including some of the veterans, like the card scheme, Visa, MasterCard, all of these organizations, right? So there's definitely a shift in terms of we need to start adapting these new technologies now. They're here to stay. Now, the big question is, can we do it in a way that's not going to disrupt negatively our current operations, right? And can we do it safely? Can we do it efficiently, right? And sometimes the answer is maybe you can if you buy another organization that's
Yeah.
smaller, more nimble, agile, and who's going to be able to do those things for you and with you, right? And sometimes you cannot, right? And I think as an organization, it's all about from a strategic perspective, right? Being cut of your strength and your weaknesses, right? You genuinely it would be really tough for a traditional bank to compete with a startup who's AI native, for example, right? It's not the same system, it's not the same regulation, it's not the same team, it's just not the same culture, right? And so that's where the conversations now come around. If we're not able to compete with them, do we buy them, or
Uh-huh.
do we want to then start changing the culture within this organization to be a little bit more AI forward? And what does that entail, right? What do we lose from that perspective? I think a lot of time people like to compare, banks with startups, but I always go back to the fundamental of it's not the same set of regulation, right? It's not the same set of requirements. So you're not really starting from the same standpoints, right? And so there's many things that you can do as a startup that you just cannot do as a bank, right? And so those are the things that all of these big companies have to take into consideration before they move forward, right? And I touched on this before around AI and blindly, adding AI to your system. But there are things like data privacy that, there are laws around these things that you have to be very careful about. And so it is important for us to recognize that technology is here to stay, whether it's AI, whether it's blockchain, stablecoin, but that implementation is where, we'll see the winners and the losers.
Have you seen banks or bigger organizations buy smaller companies like you just described? Is it something that happens a lot these days?
Yeah, I think there's been, I believe it's Mastercard that bought BVNK, who's a leader in stablecoin. So there's nothing new there, right? Every time you have, incumbents, you have these new players. The question now becomes, things are moving fast. I need to make sure I have a hand in this new technology. What do I do? And a lot of times it's buying them because you're not going to be able to compete with them head to head, right? And so we've seen a lot of these things happening, right? Again, from my own perspective as an operator, right, the buying is just the first step. The second is, the integration and the operations and making sure that you're not breaking either systems, whether it's the culture, whether it's the legacy. And that's the tough part, that the jury is still out because a lot of these conversations and a lot of these things are still very new.
So, do you feel there's a risk, let's say, of let's call it the blockbuster syndrome here for bigger organizations, right? Like Netflix was this small startup that just passed them and became this mammoth thing, right?
'Cause I think a lot of the players are very, very in tune with what's happening in
Uh-huh.
the space, right? So if you think about stablecoin, for example, I did mention that all of these big organizations got together, 140 banks, card scheme, stablecoin players, everybody to say, hey, this is the way of the future. Let's get together and put in place a framework that works for all of us, right? And so I think that they're not necessarily sitting there idle, not doing anything. They're making moves, they're acquiring, they're getting together, they're looking into regulations and they're, looking into how they can support their organizations. Some traditional organization, I believe, like Western Union, for example, issued a stable coin. So people are making a lot of moves, which, at the end of the day, like I said, is showing that we're moving towards a certain direction in this industry. But then again, it's all going to come down to adoption and operations.
All right. We're almost at time, Awa. Before I let you go, quick lightning round of questions. So no overthinking, just what comes to mind. So what's the most overrated thing in, let's say, financial in cross-border payment organizations or sector?
Huh. Interesting. Okay. I'd say the conversations around AI is overrated because there's a lot of noise. Not because AI is bad, but there's a lot of noise.
Yeah. What do you think is the false promise or the mirage that people are having with AI?
Well, there was these news recently of a number of organizations laying off people because they thought AI was going to replace all these people, and then quickly going back and trying to hire people because they realized that it wasn't going to work, right? So there's a lot of mirage or noises around, the promises that AI and it can do and the things that AI could potentially achieve. And if we don't take the time to really look into how can humans and AI work together? At this point in time, it's not a conversation about replacement. It is a conversation about augmentation. Like you said, to me, it's even a conversation about humans operating AI, right? Which is a very different framework. So that's where I think there's a little bit of challenges and risk.
What do great leaders in your sector do that average ones don't?
They listen, right? You listen to the teams, you listen to the industry, you listen to what's happening around you, especially if you work in countries that you're not familiar with, you've never been to, you were not born into. And understanding how culture affects business is so key and important. And so I think great leaders, they listen and they pay attention and they're very attuned with what's happening and where the industry and the organization and the teams are going. And they're able to make those decisions based on all of these.
And what would you do if you weren't doing what you're doing right now?
Is it what would I do if I didn't need money, if there was no money involved, or what would I do if I wasn't doing this?
Whatever angle you want.
Sure, I think I'm a builder at heart, right?
Mhm.
I really enjoy building processes and, scaling an organization, taking something from an idea to reality. I really enjoy that. So I'd probably be doing something within this entrepreneurial/startup realm. Could be anything, right? I've done fintech and financial services. I've done foods. I've done CPG. It really could be anything, but I would certainly be looking to build something.
Right. Speaking of that, maybe you could give us some information about your retail company. How do you call it? CPG company.
No.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Noom.
so Noom is a luxury CPG brand, and we provide artisan salts from Africa. So think about, smoked salt, truffle salt, wine infused salt. And this organization kind of was born out of this need to, number one, provide really high quality, aesthetically pleasing products to the African diaspora or people who care about the culture. And number two, changing the narrative around African products, right? So that's essentially what we've been doing. It kind of started out as a little bit of a passion project, and we've gained a lot of momentum and attention. We were recognized by Oprah dailies and food and beverage magazine editors. And so, it's been a very interesting journey, right? Very different from what I've done in the past, but also very rewarding in understanding what it's like to be an entrepreneur and the CEO and of.
Great. Oh, it's been a genuinely great conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to discuss with me today. I really appreciated how honest and open your answers were. This is exactly what this show is for, right? So, where can our listeners find you or follow what you're doing or building right now?
Absolutely. So I'm available on LinkedIn. And if you're looking for me from the perspective of startup advisory, you have an idea, you need an operator to support and help you scale, you can certainly find me on LinkedIn. We're on Instagram as well. It's N_origins. And so, you can try out our salts.
Excellent. And thank you all for listening to Digital Leaders Club. If you're a leader, just like Awa, and would like to continue this conversation, we'd love to do that with you. So you can find us at engeno.ca. Until next time, thank you very much.
Thank you.